The smell of cinnamon and nutmeg still clings to my sweater as I tell you this story. It was supposed to be our first Christmas without Harold. Just me, my son David, and his wife Carmen. I had spent 3 days preparing everything the way Harold would have wanted. The turkey was golden, the stuffing made from his grandmother's recipe, and I had even polished the china we only used for special occasions. That Christmas Eve, as I sat in our empty dining room staring at the 3 place settings I had so carefully arranged, I realized something that would change everything. They weren't just late. They had chosen to abandon me for her family's celebration, leaving me with nothing but the echo of my own footsteps and the crushing weight of being forgotten by the people I had raised with my own hands. What I discovered in the weeks that followed would teach me that sometimes being left behind is exactly where you need to be to find your way forward. I started cooking at 5 in the morning that Christmas Eve, the way Harold and I had done for 37 years. My hands moved automatically through the familiar motions, chopping celery, seasoning the turkey, rolling out pie dough until it was paper thin. The kitchen felt different, without his voice humming Christmas carols behind me. But I pushed through the silence because I knew David and Carmen would appreciate the effort. I had called them 2 weeks earlier, my voice trembling just slightly, as I explained how this would be our first Christmas as a smaller family. The dining room table gleamed under the chandelier Harold had installed the year David was born. I placed his favorite red cloth napkins at each setting, the ones with tiny embroidered holly leaves that I had stitched by hand decades ago. Everything had to be perfect, not just for them, but because I needed to prove to myself that I could still create something beautiful, even in the shadow of loss. The house smelled like home, like Christmas, like all the years when our table overflowed with laughter, and David would sneak extra helpings of mashed potatoes when he thought I wasn't looking. As afternoon melted into evening, I found myself adjusting and readjusting the silverware, polishing glasses that were already spotless. I had made David's favorite cranberry sauce from scratch, the kind with whole berries that pop between your teeth. Carmen always said she preferred the canned version, but I thought maybe this year she might change her mind. Maybe this year she would see how much love I could pour into something as simple as cranberries, sugar, and thyme. The turkey came out at exactly 6:30, its skin crackling and golden, just the way Harold used to like it. I set it on the carving board he had made in his workshop, running my fingers along the smooth oak one more time. Everything was ready. The table set for 3, wine breathing in Harold's favorite decanter, candles flickering like tiny prayers in the growing darkness. I had even put on the green dress David had complimented last Easter, hoping it might make him smile. But as I stood in that perfect kitchen surrounded by all that careful preparation, a cold certainty settled in my chest, like ice. They weren't coming. I could feel it in the stillness of my phone, in the way the evening shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. Somewhere across town, they were probably settling in around Carmen's mother's table, and I was just here, waiting for people who had already forgotten I existed. 7 o'clock came and went without a word. I sat in Harold's old recliner, the one that still held the shape of his body, staring at my phone like it might ring through sheer force of will. The turkey was getting cold, the candles burning lower, and my stomach had twisted itself into knots that had nothing to do with hunger. I kept checking the volume, making sure I hadn't somehow missed their call, even though the silence in the house was so complete. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking 3 rooms away. At 7:30, I finally sent a text. "Everything's ready whenever you are," with one of those cheerful emoji faces that felt like lying. The little check mark appeared immediately. Delivered. Read. But no response came. I watched those 3 dots appear and disappear twice, as if David was typing something, and then thinking better of it. The waiting was worse than knowing, worse than the truth I was too afraid to name. I tried to eat a small plate, thinking maybe they were just running late. Maybe Carmen's hair appointment had gone long, or they'd gotten caught in traffic. But every bite tasted like cardboard, and the beautiful meal I had poured my heart into felt like ashes in my mouth. The dining room, which had seemed so warm and inviting just hours before, now felt cavernous and cold. Those 3 place settings looked like a cruel joke, evidence of hope that was slowly dying with each passing minute. By 8 o'clock, I knew with the kind of certainty that settles in your bones. They weren't coming. This wasn't about traffic or forgotten time. This was a choice. Carmen's family always celebrated on Christmas Eve, and I had been foolish enough to believe that this year, our first Christmas without Harold, might be different. But grief doesn't make you a priority. It makes you an inconvenience, something uncomfortable that people would rather avoid than face. I sat in that silent house, surrounded by all the love I had tried to cook into existence, and felt something inside me crack open, not break. Breaking would have been cleaner somehow. This was more like a slow split, the way ice forms hairline fractures before it finally gives way. They had made their choice, and it wasn't me. But what I did next would make them question everything. The next morning brought a text that felt like a slap, disguised as an apology. "So sorry, Mom. Carmen's family dinner ran really late, and we were exhausted. Hope you had a nice, quiet evening." Nice and quiet, as if I had chosen solitude, as if spending Christmas alone was some kind of treat, instead of the abandonment it actually was. I stared at those words until they blurred, feeling the careful politeness that hurt more than honesty ever could have. I wrapped up all that beautiful food and put it in containers that would sit in my refrigerator for weeks, growing a skin of ice crystals that looked like tiny tears. The turkey that should have been shared became sandwiches I ate mechanically, without tasting. The cranberry sauce turned into something I spooned directly from the jar while standing at the kitchen counter, not bothering with a proper plate. Every bite was a reminder of how much care I had wasted on people who saw me as optional. Harold used to say I was the glue that held our family together, but sitting there in my kitchen full of leftovers, I realized I had been more like wallpaper, present, expected, but easily ignored when something more interesting came along. David had grown up in this house, eaten thousands of meals at that table, and yet when it came time to choose, I wasn't even in the running. Carmen's mother had won a competition I didn't even know I was part of. I found myself walking through the house, touching things Harold and I had collected over the years. The ceramic angels from our honeymoon, the photo of David's college graduation, the throw pillows I had needle-pointed during his difficult teenage years. Each object felt like evidence of a life that mattered to no one but me. I was becoming one of those old women who live in museums of their own making, surrounded by memories that mean nothing to anyone else. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful anymore. It was accusatory. It whispered all the things I was too afraid to admit, that I had become disposable, that the family I had devoted my life to building had outgrown their need for me. I was the tree that had nurtured them to strength, and now they had grown tall enough to block out my sun. The realization didn't come all at once. It seeped into me slowly, like water through a crack in the foundation, until I was drowning in it. If this story is touching your heart, stay with me. There's so much more I need to share with you. Sitting in Harold's chair that morning, I began to see the signs I had been ignoring for years. David's visits had become shorter, more obligatory. Carmen rarely made eye contact anymore, always busy with her phone or checking the time like she had somewhere better to be. They came for birthdays and holidays, but it felt more like checking items off a list than genuine desire to spend time with me. I had been so grateful for any attention that I hadn't noticed how hollow it had become. Last Thanksgiving, they had arrived 2 hours late and left before dessert, claiming they had promised to stop by Carmen's sister's house. The year before, David had spent most of Christmas Day on work calls, barely looking up from his laptop long enough to open the gifts I had chosen so carefully. I had made excuses for them, told myself they were just busy, that young couples needed to divide their time between families. But the truth was simpler and more painful. I had become the family obligation, not the family joy. I remembered the way Carmen's face lit up when she talked about her mother's parties, the animated stories about her childhood home where there was always music and laughter and chaos. When she described my house, she used words like quiet and traditional. and not in a good way. I realized that in her world, I wasn't the warm grandmother figure I thought I was. I was the duty visit, the woman who served dinner at exactly 6 and expected everyone to sit still and make polite conversation. Harold had seen it coming, I think. In the months before he died, he would sometimes watch David and Carmen with this sad, knowing expression. When I would chatter excitedly about holiday plans or family gatherings, he would just nod and pat my hand in a way that felt more like comfort than agreement. He knew what I was too hopeful to accept, that our son was already building a new family, and we were becoming the old one, the one he had grown beyond. The hardest part was admitting that maybe I had contributed to this distance. Maybe my grief over Harold had made me too needy, too desperate for connection. Maybe my traditions felt suffocating instead of comforting. But even as I tried to find fault with myself, a small voice inside me whispered that none of that justified abandonment. None of that made it okay to leave an old woman alone on Christmas, with nothing but her own echoing footsteps and the devastating silence of a phone that never rang. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, asking myself questions I was afraid to answer. Had Harold's death made me too much work? Was I calling too often, needing too much, expecting too much from a son who had his own life to live? I replayed every conversation from the past year, searching for clues about when I had become a burden instead of a blessing. The thoughts circled like vultures, picking at my confidence until there was nothing left but doubt and self-recrimination. I wondered if Carmen saw me as the kind of mother-in-law who would never be satisfied, never approve, never step back enough to let them breathe. I had tried so hard to be welcoming, to include her in family traditions, to treat her like the daughter I never had. But maybe that effort had felt like pressure, like I was trying to force a closeness that wasn't natural. Maybe my grief had made me cling too tightly to the relationships I had left, and they had pulled away to protect themselves from my need. The worst thought came in the dark hours before dawn. What if I was becoming one of those elderly women who live in the past, talking too much about people who are gone, boring everyone with stories they've heard a dozen times before? What if my house felt like a mausoleum to them, full of Harold's things and Harold's memories, and my stubborn refusal to let go and move on? What if they looked at me and saw not their mother and mother-in-law, but a sad old woman who couldn't accept that her time of being central to anyone's world was over? I got up and walked through the house again, seeing it through their eyes, the walls covered with family photos spanning decades, Harold's reading glasses still on the side table where he had left them, the quilt his mother had made draped over the couch like a shrine to people who were already gone. Maybe this house felt like a tomb to them, and I was the ghost who couldn't find peace. Maybe they avoided me not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. But even as I tortured myself with these possibilities, another part of me rebelled against the guilt. I had loved them faithfully, supported them unconditionally, opened my heart and home to them, without reservation. If that had become too much, if my love had somehow transformed into something they needed to escape from, then maybe the problem wasn't just with me. Maybe the problem was with a world that taught people to discard the inconvenient, to abandon the aging, to treat love like a limited resource that could be used up and thrown away. 3 weeks after that devastating Christmas, while cleaning out Harold's desk to keep my hands busy and my mind occupied, I found an envelope with my name written in his careful script. My hands trembled as I opened it, expecting maybe a love letter or final instructions for his funeral arrangements. Instead, I found something that would turn my understanding of everything upside down. Legal documents for a house I didn't know we owned, and a letter explaining why he had kept this secret from everyone, including me. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, and I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably feeling more alone than you ever thought possible. I've watched how David pulls away whenever we need anything, how Carmen looks at her watch during every visit. I've seen what you refuse to see. They're already building their life without us in it, and when I'm gone, they'll try to build it without you too. The house, he explained, was something he had bought quietly 5 years earlier, with money from an investment account I didn't know existed. It was small but beautiful, in a neighborhood filled with people our age, people who understood that life didn't end at 70. He had furnished it slowly, carefully, thinking of me in every room. The kitchen had the kind of big windows I had always wanted. The garden was already planted with my favorite roses. It was waiting for me, he wrote, for the day when I would need to remember that I was a complete person, not half of a couple, not just somebody's mother. I bought this house because I love you too much to leave you at the mercy of people who see you as optional, the letter continued. David is our son, and I love him, but he's learned to take your devotion for granted. You've been so busy being indispensable that you forgot to be independent. This house is your reminder that you don't have to wait for anyone's permission to live fully. The keys were taped to the bottom of the envelope, along with the address and instructions for accessing the account he had set up to maintain the property. As I held those keys, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not just surprise, but possibility. Harold had seen what I was too loyal to acknowledge, and in his quiet way, he had built me a bridge to a life I didn't even know I was allowed to want. Reading his words, I realized that my husband had given me something more valuable than security or shelter. He had given me choice. For the first time since his death, I didn't have to wait for David and Carmen to include me in their plans. I could make my own. The next morning, I drove to the address Harold had written down, my heart hammering with an excitement I hadn't felt in years. The house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with mature oak trees, their branches creating a canopy of green that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns on the sidewalk. It was smaller than our family home, but it felt immediately welcoming in a way that spoke to something deep in my chest. The front porch had a swing, and I could already imagine myself sitting there in the evenings, watching the world settle into dusk. Inside, I found Harold's love letter to me, written in furniture and carefully chosen details. The kitchen was painted the soft yellow I had admired in magazines, but never dared to suggest for our more formal home. The living room had built-in bookshelves, already filled with novels I had mentioned wanting to read someday. In the bedroom, he had placed a photograph of us from our honeymoon, young and laughing, alongside a note that said, "Remember who you were before you became what everyone needed you to be." Every room revealed new evidence of how deeply Harold had known me, how carefully he had listened to the dreams I thought I had whispered too quietly for anyone to hear. The bathroom had a deep, soaking tub, positioned perfectly to catch the morning light. The spare bedroom was set up as a craft room, complete with a sewing machine and supplies for the quilting I had abandoned when life got too busy with taking care of everyone else. He had seen the woman I had been, the woman I could still be, and he had built her a home. The garden took my breath away. Harold had planted climbing roses along the back fence, the pale pink variety I had fallen in love with at a garden show 20 years ago. There were herbs I could use for cooking, vegetables that would give me purpose, and a small greenhouse where I could nurture things to life even in winter. A stone path wound through it all, leading to a bench positioned to catch both morning sun and evening shade. This wasn't just a garden. It was an invitation to remember that growth was still possible, that beauty could still be cultivated, even in the later chapters of life. Standing in that garden, surrounded by Harold's faith in my future, I felt something crack open inside me. Not the painful fracturing I had experienced at Christmas, but something like an egg hatching, revealing life that had been waiting patiently for the right conditions to emerge. I wasn't just Harold's widow or David's mother. I was Margaret, a woman with her own desires and dreams, and the means to pursue them. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe fully. This house wasn't just a place to live. It was Harold's final gift to me, a reminder that love doesn't always look like holding on. Sometimes the deepest love looks like letting go, like creating space for someone to discover who they are when they're not busy being who everyone else needs them to be. The following week, I met with Harold's lawyer, a kind man named Robert, who had helped arrange the house purchase and the secret account that funded it. Sitting in his office, I learned just how thoroughly my husband had planned for my independence. The account contained enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, carefully invested and managed to provide steady income. But more than that, Harold had structured everything to be entirely in my name, untouchable by anyone else, including David. Harold was very specific about this, Robert explained, sliding papers across his desk for my signature. He wanted you to have complete financial autonomy. He said he'd watched too many widows become dependent on their children's goodwill, and he wasn't going to let that happen to you. The words hit me like a revelation. Harold had seen what I was blind to. That dependence, even on people who love you, can become a cage. By ensuring I would never need David and Carmen's financial support, he had freed me from having to accept whatever scraps of attention they chose to offer. I discovered that the house wasn't Harold's only secret preparation. He had quietly changed the beneficiary on several accounts, creating a clear distinction between what would pass to David as inheritance and what was designated for my care and independence. Your husband was adamant that these funds were for your life, your choices, your freedom, Robert continued. He said he didn't want you spending your remaining years trying to earn love by being convenient or undemanding. As Robert walked me through the financial details, I felt a power I hadn't experienced since my working days. I didn't have to ask anyone's permission to travel, to redecorate, to help charities I cared about, or to simply exist without justifying the space I took up in the world. The money wasn't just about security, it was about dignity. It was Harold's way of making sure I would never have to choose between my self-respect and my relationships, never have to tolerate dismissal or neglect because I had nowhere else to turn. Walking out of that lawyer's office, I felt fundamentally changed. I wasn't just grieving widow anymore, waiting for crumbs of attention from a son who had learned to take me for granted. I was a woman with options, with resources, with the ability to shape my own days, according to my own desires. Harold had given me something more precious than love. He had given me the means to love myself, to value myself, to demand the respect I deserved. That evening I called David to tell him I was moving, not to ask permission, not to seek approval, but to inform him of a decision I had already made. The surprised silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know about how long it had been since I had asserted my own will, my own agency. For too long I had been a supporting character in everyone else's story. Harold had handed me the pen to write my own. David appeared at my door 3 days later, his face creased with the kind of concern that comes more from inconvenience than genuine worry. "Mom, we need to talk about this moving idea," he said, settling into Harold's chair like he owned it. Like he had the right to make decisions about my life. "You're not thinking clearly. This house has all your memories, all your history. You can't just abandon everything Dad built for a whim." I noticed he didn't ask how I was feeling, didn't inquire about my reasons, didn't wonder if I might have good cause for wanting change. Carmen stood behind him, her arms crossed, looking around our living room like she was cataloging what might be valuable, what might be worth keeping. When they eventually had to deal with my stuff, the expression on her face, polite disapproval mixed with barely concealed impatience, told me that this intervention had been her idea, that she saw my independence as a problem to be solved, rather than a choice to be respected. "We're worried about you living alone," she said, though her tone suggested she was more worried about the inconvenience my decision might cause them. I sat across from them. These two people I had loved and sacrificed for and accommodated for so many years, and felt something crystallize inside me. They weren't here because they missed me or wanted me to be happy. They were here because my moving disrupted their comfortable arrangement where I was available when needed, but otherwise out of the way. The house they wanted me to stay in wasn't my home to them. It was their future investment, their inheritance, the financial security they had been counting on, without ever discussing it with me. "I've already signed the papers," I said quietly, watching their faces change as the reality hit them. "The house is mine, bought and paid for, and I'm moving next month." David's mouth opened and closed like he was trying to catch breath, while Carmen's expression shifted to something harder, more calculating. In that moment I saw them clearly, not as my beloved family, but as two people who had grown comfortable with my compliance, my availability, my willingness to shape my life around their needs. The argument that followed revealed truths that had been lurking beneath years of polite family dinners and obligatory holiday visits. David accused me of being impulsive, of making decisions based on grief rather than logic. Carmen suggested I was having some kind of breakdown, that widows often made poor choices in their emotional state. Neither of them asked what I wanted or why I might need this change. They talked about me like I wasn't there, like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person with valid desires and the right to pursue them. When they finally left muttering about getting some sense into me and talking to the lawyer about this, I sat in the sudden silence and felt not sadness, but relief. For the first time in years, I had stood my ground, asserted my own will, refused to be talked out of what I knew was right for me. They would adjust to my decision, or they wouldn't. But either way, I was done asking permission to live my own life. Moving day came with September sunshine and the kind of crisp air that makes everything feel possible. I hired movers for the furniture, but I packed my personal treasures myself, making conscious decisions about what belonged in my new life and what could be left behind. I took Harold's favorite books, the photo albums full of memories worth keeping, the kitchen tools that had served me well for decades, but I left behind the heavy furniture that had anchored me to a life that no longer fit, the formal dining room set that had hosted too many stilted conversations, the decorative objects that had been purchased to impress rather than to bring joy. My new neighbors welcomed me with genuine warmth that felt startling. After years of polite distance, Eleanor from next door brought homemade cookies and an invitation to join the neighborhood book club. Frank across the street offered to help with any household repairs and mentioned the community garden where residents shared vegetables and friendship in equal measure. These were people who understood that life continues, that aging doesn't mean disappearing, that community can be chosen rather than simply inherited. Within weeks, I discovered rhythms and pleasures I had forgotten existed. I woke up when my body felt rested, not when someone else's schedule demanded it. I cooked meals I actually wanted to eat, tried recipes that intrigued me rather than sticking to the familiar dishes that had pleased Harold and David for so many years. I read novels in the bathtub, painted the guest room a bold lavender color I had always loved, planted flowers based solely on their ability to make me smile when I looked at them. David called occasionally, his voice carrying a mixture of confusion and resentment that I had refused to be talked out of my foolishness. Carmen sent a few terse text messages, usually when they needed something from me. Information about family history, Harold's old tools, the recipe for his mother's apple pie. But the desperate need for their approval, the anxious monitoring of their moods and preferences had vanished along with my dependence on their attention. I still loved David, but I no longer needed him to validate my existence. The most surprising discovery was how much energy I had been spending on managing other people's comfort with my life choices, without the constant mental load of anticipating David's needs, accommodating Carmen's preferences, and maintaining a household that served everyone but myself. I found reserves of enthusiasm and curiosity I thought I had lost forever. I joined a quilting circle, volunteered at the local literacy center, and started taking photography classes. I was learning to see beauty again, to create it, to trust my own instincts about what mattered. 6 months after moving, I hosted my first dinner party, not for family obligation or holiday tradition, but simply because I wanted to share good food and conversation with people who enjoyed my company. The table was set with mismatched dishes I had chosen for their charm rather than their formality, filled with neighbors who laughed easily and stayed late and helped with the dishes without being asked. Sitting at the head of that table, surrounded by genuine warmth and appreciation, I realized that Harold had been right. I had needed to remember who I was when I wasn't busy being what everyone else needed me to be. A year later, I celebrated Christmas in my own home, surrounded by people who had chosen to be there, people who saw me as a gift rather than an obligation. Eleanor brought her famous eggnog. Frank played guitar while we sang carols that ranged from beautiful to hilariously off-key. And Maria from 3 houses down taught me how to fold paper stars, like the ones from her childhood in El Salvador. The tree was smaller than the one David and I used to wrestle into our old living room, but it sparkled with ornaments chosen for joy rather than tradition, each one a small celebration of this new life I had built from nothing but choice and courage. David and Carmen sent a Christmas card with a generic message, and their names printed in gold script. I hung it on the refrigerator next to photos of my quilting group, my book club friends, and the community garden harvest I had helped tend all summer. Their absence no longer felt like rejection. It felt like freedom. I had spent too many years trying to earn love from people who had already decided I was optional, and I was done auditioning for a role in my own family. The house Harold built for me had become more than shelter. It was proof that love doesn't always look like holding on tight. Sometimes the deepest love looks like letting go, like trusting someone enough to give them the tools to build their own happiness. He had seen what I was too hopeful to accept, that our son had already moved beyond us, and instead of fighting that reality, he had prepared me to thrive in it. This Christmas morning I woke up in my own bed, in my own home, surrounded by my own choices. I made coffee in my sunny yellow kitchen, read a chapter of a novel that made me laugh out loud, and planned the day according to my own desires, rather than anyone else's expectations. I thought of Harold, not with the desperate grief that had once threatened to drown me, but with gratitude for the gift he had given me, the chance to discover that I was not half of something that had been broken, but a whole person who had simply been waiting for permission to bloom. The scent of cinnamon and nutmeg still lingers, not from loss this time, but from joy I created for myself. If this story spoke to your heart, leave me a comment, a like, a word. I read everything with such care, and if you want to stay with me here, please subscribe. It would be my joy to share more stories like this with you.